Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning on the other side of the pond, and welcome to our panel discussion titled Making Rule of Law Resilience Work in EU Enlargement. My name is Daniel Hegedüs. I work as Deputy Director at the Institute for European Politics, IEP in Berlin, and it is my utmost pleasure to warmly welcome our today's panelists, Borjan Gjuzelov, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje, Jelena Pejić, Senior Researcher and Program Manager at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, Anamarija Velinovska, Head of EU Integration Program, also at the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje, and last but not least, Zoran Nechev, Policy Advocacy Fellow at Think Europe in Ljubljana and Senior Researcher Fellow at IEP here in Berlin. Thank you all for joining this panel today. Over the past decade, it has become a commonplace to recall the EU's vanishing transformative agenda in candidate countries, which is caused by the weak credibility of the enlargement offer, the EU's preference for geopolitical loyalty and stabilocracy over democratic reforms, as well as also by the democratic erosion within EU member states themselves, and all of which have further weakened the credibility of democratic conditionality in the enlargement context. Notwithstanding this, Russia's full-scale invasion reinvigorated the EU's enlargement process, not only with regard to Ukraine and Moldova, but also among the long-standing candidate countries in the Western Balkans, which resulted in elevated ambitions to conclude accession negotiations, for example, in the case of Montenegro, and draft the country's accession treaty potentially during the coming year. And this increased the political attention and readiness on the part of the EU to acknowledge the geopolitical importance and urgency of the enlargement on the one hand, but unfortunately also the significant democratic erosion in Serbia and Georgia, for example, and the repeated and systemic Russian meddling in democratic processes in Moldova. On the other hand, they have once again brought the question of the rule of law and rule of law resilience back into focus. And this is where the RESILIO-ACCESS project, a joint initiative of the Institute for European Politics and the Institute for Democracy, which is kindly supported by the Mercator Foundation, seeks to contribute to successful and well-informed enlargement policy. RESILIO-ACCESS, with its long and official title, Resilience Observatory on the Rule of Law in EU Accession Candidates, measures how resilient is the rule of law in candidate countries, analyzes how enlargement policy can contribute to stable democratic structures and the rule of law, and highlights the role of active and democratic civil society in maintaining the rule of law resilience. And we are particularly happy and proud today that our RESILIO-ACCESS experts can share their latest insights and recommendations with you on all these very relevant and burning topics. And before I would pass over the floor, just a couple of sentences about the housekeeping rules. We will have an approximately 40-45 minutes long moderated panel discussion, followed by the Q&A session. And you are welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions anytime using either the Q&A function or the chat function of Zoom, and we will do our best to incorporate your questions into the discussion. And I also would like to remind you that the event is being recorded and will be made available online at the YouTube channel of IEP. And having said that, I would like to ask Zoran to give us a brief introduction to RESILIO-ACCESS itself, the guiding questions of the project, its methodology, and the policy relevance of the freshly published RESILIO Snapshots, on the findings of which our today presentations are built. Zoran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon on all our speakers on today's presentation. Yeah, so I will start that, we live in a moment where democracies are under pressure, like it has never been before, especially not in the recent history. So for the first time in over 2 decades or even more, there are more autocracies than democracy. The rule of law has declined only last year by 70% globally. And these autocratic actors are targeting media, exploiting corruption, dismantling checks and balances. So sometimes from within the government themselves, the governments which are democratically elected. And this is not only happening on the margins of the international system, but this is happening, and we are seeing this in the EU member states. We are also seeing in the countries that aspire to join, and that is hence our focus in the RESILIO-ACCESS. So the question we are trying to answer with RESILIO-ACCESS is not just what is happening to the rule of law, but why some systems hold while others collapse. What is that gives certain legal and political systems the capacity to absorb pressure, resist erosion, and recover when things are going wrong? And this is what the project is all about, and how we have envisaged it more than a year. So before I go further, I just want to precisely explain what do we mean in at least how we see it, how we see and define resilience in the project, because it's widely used. So I think that certain precision here is important, and I will read you the definition of resilience. So we apply the definition that resilience of the rule of law means its capacity to prevent, to cope with, or recover from hazardous events or incremental threats without losing its core function, structure, and purpose. And we pay particular attention to the last part. So we are not asking whether a system survives a shock, but we are asking whether it comes out on the other side still recognizable itself, still protecting the rights, still constraining arbitrary power, and still accountable to the citizen. So within that, we work with two distinct analytical concepts. One is looking at resilience as a capacity, and the other one is looking at resilience as a performance. When we talk about resilience as a capacity, what we mean is actually identifying and measuring the condition, the resources that position a system to respond and recover better. This is about what the system can, what a system has before the crisis actually hits. When we talk about resilience as a performance, this is about what the system does when it matters. So we are measuring how the rule of law actually behaves when confronted with specific stress. So it's a combination of both dimensions that equally covers our interpretation of resilience. And when we look at how resilience actually plays in practice, we can identify at least three distinct outcomes or types of resilience. The first one is continuation. So the rule of law withstands a given level of stress without substantial deterioration, or it holds firm. The second one is resistance. So the rule of law suffers certain level of erosion, so some erosion, but manages to limit the negative impact of the shocks and preserves its core functions or structures. This is the most trouble form, but still, it's a resilience nevertheless. And the third outcome is bouncing back. So bounce back when the rule of law not only resists the shock, but returns to its previous pre-crisis level. So all of these three types of continuation, resistance, and bounce back give us an analytical vocabulary for comparing countries and trajectories. So how we came up with the idea of RESILIO-ACCESS? Actually, it builds on the original RESILIO project, which was developed already by the Institute for European Politics in Berlin. So the original project created a rigorous model for measuring the resilience of rule of law in the EU member states. So what we have decided, there is already a system in the member states or for the member states, why not expand it to also include the ones which are actual candidates, so the one which are actually wanting to become part of the European Union, and by doing so, actually to apply the same rules and standards as the one inside the European Union, as far as we know, or what the methodology actually says, that in all the candidate countries, procedure for accession, the fundamental has the biggest impact, or the way the methodology actually is written, it needs to provide balance between rule of law or the fundamental clusters and all the other clusters. So if we look at it by the book, and if we extract the veto that member states have, actually, if there is no progress in the fundamental clusters on the rule of law issues, all the others cannot progress. If I can see it and if I can point it out a situation similar like that without using it as a method, as part of the methodology, is actually a situation in which Serbia is nowadays. So RESILIO-ACCESS takes the frameworks of RESILIO, so the initial one, the one related to the EU member states, further in two important directions. And I already mentioned the first one. So the first one is expanding the focus to all the candidate countries. So we have all the 6 in the Western Balkans: Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Kosovo, but also to the other 3, well, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. Yeah, Georgia is still a candidate, but also we are looking at, as a specific case study, we are also looking at Turkey. So how this prolonged or now already non-existent accession process with Turkey actually influences the rule of law in that country, and what kind of recommendation or what kind of findings we can take and then try and kind of translate it to the current candidate countries. So these are the countries where the EU accession is explicitly designed, and as I mentioned, because of the fundamental cluster, it is, at least in theory, designed to strengthen the rule of law. But we still have a surprisingly weak understanding of how that actually works in practice, and whether it actually produced the durable resilience, or only provides kind of surface compliance that erodes the moment external pressure eases. So that's one of the important directions that we take with the RESILIO-ACCESS. The second one is methodological. So we took the original model, the original methodology. We thought we will just kind of adapt it to the candidate countries, but it turned out to be much more complex. So now we use also different kinds of methods of component analysis, factor analysis, etc., etc. So it is not only a technical upgrade as we have originally envisaged it, rather than simply adding resilience resources. We now methodologically can actually measure how much each resource actually contributes to the overall resilience score, which matters enormously if we want to give policymakers actionable guidance about where to invest. So this is of essential importance. I would not give you all the details because there are a lot of products that will come in the period to come. But this, I think, this is on the methodology. The project has 5 objectives. I will read them quite quickly. To improve the conceptual and measurement framework for the rule of law resilience. To identify institutional and structural factors that explain resilience in the candidate countries. To integrate rule of law resilience into the broader debate on democratic resilience. To understand how EU enlargement policy can strengthen or it fails to strengthen rule of law in the candidate countries. So in terms of and the last one, to build capacities in the civil society, to training, networking, information sharing across EU member states and accession countries, kind of creating a community of practice around these questions. And hopefully when RESILIO-ACCESS will finish, then we can try to put all the countries, EU and accession countries, in the same pot and create a methodology that fits all. So the ones inside, the ones which want to be outside. We'll finish with this. In terms of output, it's quite an ambitious project. I have to say, we have just published 9 snapshots all the elements. You will hear from our discussant today, some of them. Then by the end of the year, we will also produce 9 country reports, so for all the candidate countries. So we will create or we will publish a full comparative regional study, a structure mapping of EU enlargement toolbox and its effectiveness, specifically in regards to the rule of law, accompanied with a policy paper with a concrete recommendation, and finally a publicly accessible monitor, kind of a visualization tool, a dashboard as it is like now popularly said, which will make our data usable for not only academia but also to practitioner journalists, and hopefully also policymakers will use it in order to produce good results. We will also have produce some of the elements will be promoted on the Civil Society Forum that will take place in Ohrid in June. And then we will have throughout the whole project, and the final findings will be promoted on a final conference in Brussels. I think that's it by the end of the year. A lot of work, but it's a lot of interesting products. And I think that we are all really, kind of devoted to really push this forward and produce the best knowledge possible. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Zoran, for this excellent introduction into the conceptual framework of RESILIO-ACCESS, and particularly many thanks actually for this teaser, what to watch and what to expect from the project until the end of the year in terms of outputs. Now, I would like to turn to you, Anamarija, because in your snapshot co-authored with Zoran, you focused on the concepts of credibility and leverage as core features of enlargement policy when it comes to the rule of law resilience. And how would you summarize actually your main findings in that very crucial aspect of actually the fundamentals clusters and enforcing rule of law in candidate countries? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Just to check, can you see my presentation? Okay, perfect. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today online with us. As it was already introduced, me and my colleague Zoran Nechev have co-authored the snapshot on EU accession and the rule of law. So we are trying to address a very interesting question here, and that is whether the EU's own enlargement process can actually undermine the democratic reforms it demands from the candidate countries. And in our snapshot, we are arguing the yes answer, and we are explaining and understanding why and when this actually can happen. So as you're all probably very familiar, since 1993, the rule of law has been the cornerstone of EU enlargement, and the candidate countries are required and must show that they have stable institutions, protect fundamental rights, and fight corruption. Throughout the time, the EU has built stronger and stronger tools how to enforce these criteria. But here's the tension that we are trying to explore, and that is that the accession process can be the most powerful tool for building democracy, but it also, on certain occasions, can backfire. The difference comes to two things: whether EU keeps its promises and whether the leverage that the member states have over the process is used responsibly. So based on the model that was briefly introduced before by Zoran, let's start with the primary resources from the model that we try to apply in this context. And those are the tools, the institutional tools that EU actually has, and whether they work. So in 2020, the EU updated how it runs the accession negotiations. The revised methodology changed and introduced the thematic clustering. And by that, the so-called fundamentals cluster, a group of chapters covering courts, human rights, and security was created. And this cluster is opened first and closed at the very end of the process. This was something that before 2020 was informally implemented, but with the revised methodology, it was a formal introduced. It was introduced as a formal rule.
Apologies, Anamarija, the slides are not changing.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much.
Yes. That means that the country cannot quickly tick boxes or on trade or economy or transport without while ignoring judicial reforms, and progress on everything else depends on genuine sustained rule of law improvements. So that's also like a safeguard built in, the so-called overall balance clause. So if a country is backslides on fundamentals, the EU slows down or even reverse progress in other areas. The example of Serbia was mentioned by Zoran, so I will not repeat it, although it was not formally applied. Beyond this, also detailed roadmaps and benchmarks guide negotiations, and these are not just technical documents. They're political tools designed to make the process more predictable and credible. However, applying these instruments have shown mixed experience on the ground. Montenegro actually did constitutional amendments to change and address judicial independence. Yet still there are some kind of not capture, but judicial dependence. And then we have the case of Ukraine, which under war, in times of war, has introduced reforms in anti-corruption and judiciary. But also we have the case of Serbia, where we have laws that are laws on paper, but weak implementation. The tools, we can say that the tools are good. However, the problem becomes when there is inconsistent enforcement. But even if you have the best tools, that means nothing if society doesn't believe in the reforms. And that's where the civil society and media come in, what we called in the RESILIO-ACCESS model, the subsidiary resources. So institutions alone don't sustain reforms. People have to believe that reforms are real and worth fighting for. So civil society, independent media, and public trust are what makes reforms stick. So civil society organizations in the candidate countries play a great role. They have been the watchdog between the EU and ordinary citizens. We have the example of 2015 in North Macedonia, where in a wiretapping scandal, a group of CSUs, academia, and experts have drafted what's known as blueprint for urgent democratic reforms. And this document directly shaped EU's own reform priorities and became the baseline for restoring democratic resilience, democratic governance in North Macedonia. So the civil society wasn't on the margins of this process. It led the recovery of the democracy here. Then independent media are also equally important. We have Serbia as a counter example, where pro-government media have pro-government actors have captured most of the media, and as a result, EU progress reports are widely seen as politicized or irrelevant. And now we have a case in Serbia where the public support for EU membership is below 40, which is the lowest in the region. So that so people don't trust the message that comes from the EU. The accession process at its best actively supports these societal actors throughout funding, throughout capacity building activities. It helps journalism, it helps civil society organization to give their input into roadmaps, into reports, and provide external protection to reform-minded professionals in difficult political environment. And here is the key dynamic, which is that where the EU is seen as fair and consistent, reforms gain public support. And when the EU is seen as external interference or externally imposed reforms, they collapse, especially when the pressure eases. And then we see that the crisis hit. Wars, hybrid regimes, internal backsliding. So the crisis reveal what the accession process is actually made of. We see Ukraine and Moldova show the process at its most resilient aspect. EU candidate status has been a lifeline, a credible signal that the path to Europe remains open even under existential threat. We see judicial reforms and anti-corruption measures applied in Ukraine while under war invasion. And Moldova is implementing EU's benchmarks amid hybrid warfare. So the promise of membership has sustained momentum. I don't want to use that word, but has made these reforms more credible and legitimize them within the society. The Western Balkans tell a different story. Despite decades of formal EU commitment, the region has experienced prolonged stagnation. That uncertainty has deepened public disillusionment. It has empowered illegal leaders and entrenched skepticism about EU membership. As I mentioned, the public support in Serbia, but from recently with the renewed accession process in Montenegro and Albania, there is some hope, but recovery, I would say, is fragile and incomplete if it's not followed through. So, which brings us to how the EU actually, sorry, I totally forget to change the slides, but we will send them to the participants. Apologies. So we come to them when EU undermines itself, and I will say on 3 occasions. First, when we have decades-long negotiations, which create what we see called ever-receding horizon. When candidates can't see the finish line, motivation for reforms weakens, and enlargement fatigue inside the EU means member states are increasingly reluctant to commit. Then we have erosion of rule of law within the EU itself. So citizens in candidate countries ask, why do we face such scrutiny when while member states face no real consequences for their backsliding of rule of law? And then we have the member states' vetoes that make the situation worse. Well, I'm from North Macedonia. We have to mention this, but they're shifting the conversation from rule of law to national politics, and this is where the external actors exploit these gaps deliberately. Russia and China use alternative financing, disinformation, energy dependence to fill the credibility vacuum. And they're also using the domestic actors to legitimize their narratives within the candidate countries. So our conclusions and 3 things that we think are decisive factors for resilience and things that will give back the credibility of the process is that member states must act as guardians, not gatekeepers. and the process should be shielded from politicization. Applying of the benchmark consistently, no selective enforcement, no double standards, and finally, support for civil society and independent media must continue, especially these days since the withdrawal of US funds, which left a significant gap in organizations and entities that were fighting the most for rule of law resilience. So enlargement is not about just exporting the EU norms. It's about EU's own integrity as a community built on law and restoring the credibility, starting with Montenegro and Albania. I think it can remain its most powerful instrument for democracy across the continent. So thank you. I will stay here for questions.
Thank you so much, Anamarija. And dear colleagues, I just would like to remind you that don't forget to submit your questions into the Q&A box to our speakers. And I think, Jelena, in your snapshot, you focused on the concepts of order and security as key pillars of the rule of law. And I found that particularly interesting because actually securitizing the law and order or order and security narratives became actually, at least within the European Union, essential tools in the toolkit of illiberals and aspiring authoritarian leaders who are actually seldom true friends of the rule of law. So I would be particularly interested in your findings and insights. How can one draw the right balance that security and order indeed contribute to the rule of law and rule of law resilience in EU member states and candidate countries, and particularly how this question emerged in the enlargement context? Over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. My pleasure to explain the insights from my snapshot. It's all about the balance, but let's first start with explaining what are actually order and security. I think these are the terms very often used without explaining their substance. While Zoran already explained what the rule of law and its resilience mean. Order refers to stable, predictable, organized state of affairs in which society operates smoothly without difficulties or delay. It ensures that daily life, governance, social interactions are neither chaotic nor subject to arbitrary force. And this, which is very much important, does not arise spontaneously. It is supported by states' monopoly on force. Security, on the other hand, is a contested concept, but we can say it has objective and subjective dimension. The first one is protection from threats, and the subjective one is absence of fear. Security also has different levels, and usually national security is involved. So national security refers to protecting sovereignty, territorial integrity, population of a country, but also national security can affect human security, which refers to safety and dignity of individuals. So security between these two levels can collide. And of course, providing order and security is one of the core functions of the state. If the state cannot provide them, then we regard it as a failed state. It is the key benefit that individuals gain when they enter into social contract, transferring their sovereignty to the state. The state that cannot guarantee order and security loses legitimacy in the eyes of citizens and cannot command their obedience. We also, in the snapshot, referred to the World Justice Project, where they have operationalized order and security in 3 indicators. First, that crime is effectively controlled and perceived as such. Second, that civil conflict is effectively limited. And third, that people do not resort to violence to redress personal grievances. So already from this, you can see what are the key three contributions of order and security to the rule of law resilience. So first, they ensure the consistent enforcement of laws, because without basic order, laws become irrelevant and individuals may resort to self-help or violence to resolve their own disputes. Secondly, order and security build trust in the legal and political system, because when citizens feel secure, they are more likely to perceive institutions as legitimate and comply with laws. And third, security creates the conditions for rights and institutions to function. Because when there is no security, the focus of the state and citizens shifts to mobilizing all available means to re-establish security and to effectively manage risks and counter threats. In such situations, the state moves from business as usual to extraordinary state or state of exception, during which it can apply emergency measures that deviate from the usual regulatory framework. Also, all the institutions that we rely on, especially the ones that should act independently, such as judicial institutions or oversight regulatory institutions, if we want them to operate independently, they have to be free from intimidation or violence. And this is what also order and security in the state should provide. Of course, in crisis situations such as war, terrorism, pandemics, natural disasters, governments may introduce these extraordinary measures. And they can be very much justified and necessary, but they also create risks for the rule of law. And this is why constitutions usually allow flexibility, because they envisage rules that will apply also in these situations, especially because other rules will not apply. In this sense, the rule of law enables or ensures that the state of exception doesn't devolve into state of lawlessness. The trouble is, however, and Daniel, you already mentioned this, is when states actually excessively invoke national security, or even when governments actually conflate their own stability, regime stability, with national security, and they use it then as a pretext to suppress political opposition or any criticism to their rule. So excessive emphasis on security and order can also weaken the rule of law. This act that state official use is usually called securitization. When you invoke security, then you can have different kinds of measures, such as expanding surveillance powers, restricting public rallies, postponing elections, media, censorship, etc. And we have already witnessed such dynamics in several countries. Also, these that are covered by the RESILIO-ACCESS approach. But this order, without the rule of law, is imposed through coercion, violence, repression, and that is costly and that is unsustainable in the long term. This is superficial stability, which lacks legitimacy and fairness and evolves into authoritarianism. In such situations, citizens can revolt against the state, against the government, and these are surely the cases of civic mobilization and civic disobedience, mostly in the form of non-violent protests, which are a symptom of a deeper lack of trust in the legal system. And they also mean that the social contract that underpins order and security is broken. So we have, especially now in Serbia and Georgia, mass protests, which are framed by their governments as security threats. And citizens, protesters have been arrested, have been criminally charged, intimidated, smeared, etc. And the situation is far worse in Georgia, but coming from Serbia, I can also say that situation is very serious here too. So instead of strengthening order, such responses of governments can erode public trust, can deepen social polarization, and ultimately they weaken the rule of law itself. When we go across EU accession countries, we in the snapshot we gave an overview of some indices and where states are situated on their scales. And of course, the worst situation, the greatest stressor to order and security is, of course, in Ukraine, that is suffering aggression, so it cannot control fully its territory and its institutions, and public safety are very much affected. In such situation, the resilience of the rule of law is lower, but also since from Ukraine is expected to improve its rule of law within the EU accession process, so that is also a very hard task in such circumstances. Then we had, as I mentioned, Georgia and Serbia, where we have this superficial order and stability and oppression and repression. And overall, across all candidate states, the organized crime, I think, is a major challenge, major stressor to this resource. And they are also characterized by weak police autonomy and accountability, which allows political interference and selective law enforcement. The EU is trying to address these issues. Mostly it's through the chapters 23 and 24, but also providing financial assistance, defense cooperation, civilian and military missions. And the trouble is, as Daniel also you pointed out in the beginning, and I think also other speakers talked about it, is that it seems that the EU has long prioritized stability instead of democratic reforms, which has unintentionally reinforced illiberal governance patterns in candidate countries. So to conclude, order and security are essential pillars of the rule of law resilience because they create conditions for institutions to function and for citizens to exercise their rights safely. However, as I said, all is about balance. So too little order and security can lead to chaos and lawlessness, but too much emphasis on security and abuse of this concept can lead to authoritarian tendencies and erosion of fundamental rights. Without this balance, there can be no sustainable stability and no resilient rule of law. So this is also an appeal to the EU that stabilitocracy approach will not only lead to rule of law stagnation, but in the longer term also to instability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jelena, for this excellent overview. And I think you already inspired a lot of questions in me, certainly, and that we have also time to answer the questions that are coming into the Q&A. I already would like to remark that potentially we will go over time for 10 minutes. But before we do that, I would like to pass the floor to Borjan, because your snapshot investigates actually the relationship between judicial independence and the public expenditures of the judiciary. And I would like to ask you, what are the most important takeaways in this regard from your snapshot in the enlargement context? Over to you, Borjan.
Thank you, Daniel. Just a second can you see my presentation? Yes. Yes, I had the opportunity to take rule of law resilience from the angle of judiciary, particularly these two interrelated factors of judicial independence and judicial expenditure. These two play a vital role in the way how justice is administered, how everyday work culture of judges and prosecutors operates, and whether they are free from interference. As most of you and probably part of the audience is already aware, judiciaries in the EU accession countries that were in our focus usually faced with higher or lower extent of undue political influence, abuse of appointments and promotion procedures, inconsistent evaluation mechanisms, weak disciplinary mechanisms, but also abuse of the disciplinary mechanisms in some extent, as well as challenges related to resourcing and administration of cases in a reasonable time, which in some countries generates backlog of cases. There are also instances of vacant positions and insufficient staff. This is particularly now visible in North Macedonia, as well as inadequate facilities. And all of that limits the way and the capacity to implement procedural laws the way they should. That's also visible with the problem of like in most of the countries, it is envisioned to have audio-video recording of the proceedings, which is not usually the case because courts lack technical capacity to perform that action. Now, in regards judicial independence, we took the data from the World Justice Project from last year, and here we analyzed the indicator government powers are effectively limited by judiciary, which in a way underscores the relationship between judiciary and other two branches of power. As you can see from the screen, we analyzed 9 countries, so Western Balkans 6 countries plus Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And here Kosovo scores the highest, and it's, so to say, an outlier from the average. That's mainly due to the lack of ongoing visible controversies in that justice system, followed by Montenegro, Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, while North Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, and Ukraine are below the average. For this group, for each of these states, there is a more or less obvious reason why they score low. For instance, for North Macedonia, it's the fact that there were tremendous judicial scandals in the past few years. In Albania, the vetting mechanism didn't really lead to the desired outcomes, at least not in terms of judicial efficiency. Serbia is currently in a highly polarized situation where the trust in institutions, including judiciary, is quite low, while Ukraine, because of its situation, unfortunately, in this ranking ranks the lowest. In comparison to the independence, our indicators from judicial expenditure in EU accession countries date back from 2022 from CEPEJ. Here, Montenegro scores the highest, with both highest judicial expenditure per inhabitant, but also highest judicial expenditure as a percentage of the GDP, followed by Ukraine, Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo, while at the bottom of the table are North Macedonia, Moldova, Albania, and Georgia. Needless to say, judicial expenditure is an important figure and an important sign whether executive power, the governments are really into allowing the judicial branch to function independently, and whether they. So here it's not only important what is the judicial expenditure per capita, but also how it is allocated, whether it's stable and foreseeable enough, and whether it depends or it does not depend on the current political will of the politicians. And not to take too much time, I would say that, and you can read that in the snapshot more extensively, the relationship between these two figures, judicial expenditures and independence, they're sort of a litmus test between the words and the reality, in particular when we assess the political agendas of the incumbents in these countries. They usually always say and promise judicial independence and functional administration of justice. However, in practice, by not allowing sufficiently high and foreseeable judicial expenditure, they actually undermine judicial independence. They do that also through other means. And these gaps between this formal commitment and that to guarantee independence and the actual financing undermines not only the accession reform, but the overall strength of and resilience of the rule of law and the public confidence in the state apparatus, I would say. And few more remarks. Sustainable rule of law resilience, going back to our initial concept of rule of law and resilience, I would say it requires both an external incentive, the prospect of the EU accession that Anamarija and Zoran wrote about, and also endogenous long-term, I would say, institution building that would enable professional integrity and will be based on merit-based recruitments, promotion and dismissal procedures, and impartial accountability mechanisms for the judicial professionals. We believe that adequate resourcing and guaranteeing judicial independence shall enable fair rules of the game for judges and prosecutors, and a positive incentive structure that would reward integrity and discourage political loyalty. So to change the professional expectations within the profession that are now pretty much related to political loyalty. That would be so far what I have to present, but I remain open for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Borjan. Vitan, eye on the time, I would like to collect 4 questions and ask one question to each of you before we conclude. Jelena, you mentioned the case of Georgia, especially with regard to using the securitization discourse to discredit oppositionary forces, but partially also to discredit the European Union. But I think Georgia is also an interesting case from the perspective of the concept what was mentioned multiple times, which is the credibility of the leverage. Because if there is a EU candidate country where actually autocratization did have had a direct impact on the pace of the enlargement process, literally it resulted in its suspension, then it's Georgia. And my question to you is whether Georgia is in some way seen as a lessons learned on the Western Balkan, and particularly in the country which shows the most similar features to Georgia in an enlargement context, which is Serbia. So is the Georgian case seen in Belgrade that what clearly has shown the limits, how far a candidate country can go with illiberal measures or autocratization, or it is perceived actually as a failure or story of failure on the part of the European Union, that leverage didn't work to keep Georgia alive in the enlargement process? Anamarija, you mentioned the credibility vacuum several times in your presentation, what I found really fascinating. And I know that you write also about this in your snapshot, so I would like to ask the question that the fast positive developments over the past year in the enlargement process of Montenegro and Albania, do you see that it might give a chance to restore the credibility of the enlargement, and it will actually facilitate and foster reforms in countries that are currently lagging behind, like North Macedonia or Serbia? Or the contrary, that it can actually conclude or result in an isolation of those countries, and in some way a sort of, I don't know, divergence within the region that we used to know as Western Balkan until now. Borjan, one country struck me very much in your presentation, and that was again Georgia. It struck me very much. I'm not an expert on the topic, but it clearly struck me that it had the second best World Justice Project score when it came to independence of justice, but also that actually that result was achieved actually with the lowest judicial expenditure. And in that regard, the country appears to be a complete outlier from the model. And my question to you is whether you have any guess or explanation how and why it happens. And last but not least, to Zoran, we got the very much project-related question that you mentioned in the introduction, that RESILIO-ACCESS builds on the original RESILIO methodology, but it's an updated and extended version of that. And the methodological question came up: where are those extensions and added items to the methodology? So these are the questions. Please try to be concise with your answers, and I don't know who would like to start. Jelena? Thanks.
Okay. Yes, well, we usually do make parallels between Georgia and Serbia, but there are also many differences between these two countries, and the clearest one is geography. Serbia is surrounded by EU states or EU candidates states. Georgia has direct border with Russia and has been historically under large Russian influence. Also in Georgia, the anti-government movement has clearly been pro-European. In Serbia, that is not the case. So for Georgia, the EU could allow itself to be more strict, to be more vocal in criticism. And maybe it backfired, if you can interpret it like that, because it was not the EU that stopped the process, but the Georgian government that actually said we will pause for 4 years, and then all the repression grew in accelerated speed. Maybe that's also what the EU fears will happen for Serbia, because in the case of Serbia, it has had much milder approach. I think Anamarija mentioned it in her speech, that the population in Serbia has traditionally been Eurosceptic, and also skeptic towards the West, seeing itself as a victim of Western policies. But the regime also controls public opinion through its media, through public official statements, and it actually uses this unclear pro-European support of population in its own benefit, because it says we are the one pro-European force, and without us it will all go awry. And they also, I mean, there are clearly different ideologies within the protest movements, especially student protest movement. Of course, there are also more nationalist forces, but there are also pro-European ones. The problem was for a long time that these nationalists were kind of more visible, but the regime has also highlighted this, when making excuses toward the EU. And I think the EU fears exactly what the SNS, the ruling party, wants it to fear, and that is what will come after SNS. Will it be someone pro-European who will finish the European path of Serbia, or will some kind of suspend it? But it should be, I mean, if we only use rational arguments, there is no alternative for Serbia than to be in the EU. So these are also economic reasons, but also that we belong in the European family. We want the European standards. A lot of people that have not achieved European standards in Serbia have left to live in the European Union to live these standards. So what we expect, I mean, the approach of the EU has been very mild, but then Enlargement Commissioner Kos has made some nuances in a positive direction, but still it needs to be much more vocal, much more strict. And all these measures regarding a balance clause, reversibility, they should be made as a, very plausible threat, because if not, nothing stops this regime.
Thank you so much, Jelena. Anamarija?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, I think that we can get the both scenarios. In the optimistic case, where the advancement of Montenegro and Albania can prove that reforms are being rewarded, and can encourage other countries within the Western Balkans to deliver concrete results, and to believe that EU will deliver if and when they deliver. So advancement among in Albania and Montenegro restores the basic credibility of the conditionality logic that has been damaged in the Western Balkans. And definitely a success story is not nothing, and it can give a new energy to a process that has been so long and historic to stay. But then we have also the pessimistic scenario, and it can happen that this process of advancement of Montenegro and Albania is seen only as a sign from the EU to show that the process can move forward, and it's not based on real reforms within these countries. And the other countries can respond by concluding that the game is unfair, that the politics determine what is the outcome more than a reform performance. And this narrative already exists in the Western Balkans. It's not something new. So I think the difference here would be how EU handles the countries that are falling behind. If there are clear signs that the door remains open if you deliver on performance, I think that will, and that there are intermediate steps and that you can get some of the benefits even before full membership. I think that that can be better, bigger encouragement for the countries. But instead, if after this process with Montenegro and Albania, the process is seen as dead end, and no new countries will even compete for a membership, then the isolation becomes a reality. So I would say that the role EU will have in the region will be even bigger, and that will most certainly determine the outcomes and the behavior of other countries. And it was mentioned, but we are trying with the resilient model, the access, to see how the institutions are performing, and performance is one of the key new additions to the model. Yeah, I guess we'll see.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anamarija. Borjan?
Thank you, Daniel. Very insightful question. To be honest, I didn't notice this discrepancy before, and thank you for pointing this out. Georgia is
Apologies.
in fact, yes, no. Georgia is in fact third in comparison. Kosovo and Montenegro are ahead of Georgia, but yes, Georgia is lowest on the table on judicial expenditure. And I looked into the World Justice Project data while waiting for my turn. And I have only one explanation, which is more of a methodological explanation. And that's that World Justice Project bases their evaluations and indicators on combination between general population survey and qualified respondents questionnaire, or an expert survey. The expert survey is conducted every year, while the population survey has been, the last time it was conducted was 2017, which means that they still rely on some old data that doesn't take into account the current turmoil, both political and institutional, in Georgia. However, there is a trend, a declining trend, which I believe comes from the declining rankings of the qualified respondents questionnaire. Of course, with all these composite rankings and indexes, there is always a chance that some important event in certain country is not directly reflected in the ranking, which reminds us that we need to have also more direct ways of evaluation. This is just a broader zoom out comparative method that we used in our snapshot.
Thank you so much. I think that was a fantastically useful insight. And if I can allow some sarcasm, with some Freedom House and VDAM experience, it's good to see that not only democracy measuring projects are unable to catch up with the pace of autocratization from time to time, but this is also the challenge what rule of law measuring projects face. But thank you so much. And Zoran, you have the concluding words.
Yeah, good one. Yeah, so yeah, thanks Fiona for the question. Yeah, we have done a couple of adjustments on the RESILIO-ACCESS model. So first, we expanded the model, as I already mentioned, to cover both resilience as a capacity and as a performance. So we are not, so in addition to what is like assessing the institutional resources that support rule of law, and that would be the capacity issue, we are also adopting the model to also evaluate how these institutions actually perform under concrete political stressors. So that's the that is the difference. So the combination of both resilience as a capacity and resilience as a performance, the combination of these two dimensions adequately cover so the project's interpretation of resilience. We apply this kind of thick understanding of the rule of law, the one that not takes only seriously the formal structures, and this was the focus on the original Resilio project, but also takes the full range of threats into consideration. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect, and this is very normal because we are looking at accession countries, the model introduces accession-related dynamics as an important contextual factor. So this is very normal because previously the Resilio model was only for the member state. Now it's for the accession country. So the whole enlargement process and the rule of law and how EU assesses conditionalities, this conditionality strengthens or weakens institutional resilience or only provides incentivized short-term compliance. This is the second element that we are actually seeing, or the difference between the first and the second model. The third one is we place with the RESILIO-ACCESS, we place stronger emphasis on political and social resilience. Again, going beyond formal legal structures. So we look at civil society capacity, shrinking civic space, media freedom, investigative journalists, public trust in institution, and legal and constitutive culture. So these are all elements that we are taking now more in consideration. Fourth, the model introduces a more explicit analysis on the threat of the rule of law. That's also something that relates to the previous one. And finally, if we can take, for example, on this one level of the model, and I have to mention this disclaimer here, the model is still not finalized. So now we are in the final stages, but it needs more work in order to catch and then all these elements, and then that we can publish it. So that's the disclaimer around the model. But if I can also answer your question on the level of the specific indicators, without going into too much details, I will just mention that the original resilient model contained a large number of indicators across many thematic areas, including economic resilience, social cohesion, discourse quality, and public debate. Whereas in the Resilio-ACCESS, this indicator set has been streamlined, operationalized through the VDEM, rule of law related variables, complemented by specific indices on civil liberties, access to justice, and legislative constraints on the executive. So there have been changes not only on the model level, but also on the level of indicators, because it was also an issue when we were collecting the data that not all of these data are available for all the candidate countries. That's also one of the constraints that we had in the process. But the changes are substantial. I can say that's why it took us a little bit more time in order to develop this comprehensive model. Hopefully you're satisfied with the answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoran. Dear colleagues, thank you for this engaging and insightful discussion and for all the food for thought you provided us today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for joining us today. Please stay tuned and look out for the further products and outputs of RESILIO-ACCESS. Follow us, both for the Institute for Democracy and the Institute for European Politics in social media. Subscribe to our newsletter, and I hope that we can see each other very soon and at one of our future webinars, what we will organize. Have a nice day and goodbye.